The bear begged the forest ranger for help. When he realized the reason, he was shocked. The dense forests of western Montana were alive with whispers. Beneath towering pines whose trunks had stood through centuries of storms, the land breathed in slow, steady rhythm. This place belonged more to the wild than to man, untamed, rain-fed, and full of secrets. Forest Ranger Jack Tanner moved through it with the steady ease of someone who had long ago learned to listen rather than speak. His boots made barely a sound on the moss-covered ground, and the scent of damp pine needles filled the air as clouds darkened above, pregnant with the weight of a summer storm. It had been an unremarkable patrol so far, part of his weekly sweep along the eastern ridge, a place known more for rock slides and washed-out trails than wildlife encounters. Jack had seen no signs of hikers, no broken branches or littered food wrappers, just the usual scatter of deer tracks, the occasional distant screech of a hawk, and the low grumble of thunder building on the horizon. But then the forest changed. It started as a shift in the air, something deeper than the storm, an uneasy hush settling over the trees. The usual chatter of birds fell silent, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath. That's when Jack saw her. She stepped out from behind a cluster of ferns, her massive frame soaking wet, fur darkened by the first streaks of rain. A black bear, fully grown. Every instinct Jack possessed screamed for caution, for stillness. Bears avoided humans, they didn't approach. But this one didn't behave like any bear Jack had encountered in 2 decades of forest work. She looked at him, really looked at him. Her posture was tense but not aggressive. Her front paws were rooted to the ground, her head tilted slightly to the left, amber eyes locked with his. Then she huffed. A low, guttural sound, filled not with warning, but with urgency. Jack stood frozen, heart pounding. Rain tapped lightly on his shoulders. The bear turned, looked over her shoulder toward the eastern ridge, then back at him. There was no mistaking it. She was asking him to follow. Jack hesitated only a moment. He slung off his pack, pulled out his radio, and informed the station he was altering course to investigate a bear sighting near Grid 12E. He left the rest vague. Who would believe him if he said the bear asked for help? With practiced hands, he packed a field kit with splints, wraps, and a basic med pack. Then he followed. The bear moved quickly, sure-footed over slick rocks and fallen logs, occasionally glancing back to make sure he kept pace. Jack moved as fast as his gear and human legs would allow, ducking under low branches, leaping small creeks, his breath quickening. Rain began falling in earnest now, soaking through his jacket and turning the forest floor into a slick bed of roots and mud. They traveled nearly a mile before she stopped, standing at the edge of a collapsed ravine. Jack came up beside her and peered down into the gaping wound in the earth. It was recent. The slide had pulled down trees, soil, and shattered rock, creating a steep, unnatural pit maybe 10 feet deep. That's when he heard it, a thin, desperate cry, high-pitched and rhythmic. His eyes scanned the shadows until he saw movement. A bear cub, trapped at the bottom, its back leg twisted beneath it. The pit had steep, crumbling sides, slick with rain. The cub had no way to climb out, and every attempt only brought down more debris. Jack swore under his breath, grabbing his radio again. Station Delta, this is Tanner. I have an injured cub. Recent landslide near 12 East. I need extraction support and medical assistance. The reply crackled through the rain. Copy, Tanner. Closest unit is 3 hours out. Storm's grounding the chopper. Jack looked at the sky, darkening fast, and knew he didn't have 3 hours. Already water was beginning to collect in the pit. If the rain kept up, it would be flooded within the hour. The cub let out another terrified whimper, trying and failing to climb. Jack had to act. He anchored a rope to a nearby pine, looping it securely around the base and testing his weight against it. Hang in there, little one, he murmured. Then he started down. The descent was slow and treacherous. Loose rocks shifted beneath his boots, and mud sucked at his feet. Halfway down, he slipped. His right foot twisted violently, and he cried out as he tumbled the last few feet into the pit. Pain exploded through his ankle. For a moment, all he could hear was the roar of blood in his ears and the storm pelting his back. Gritting his teeth, Jack crawled toward the cub, dragging his injured leg. The little bear recoiled at first, but made no attempt to bite or flee. It was too scared, too hurt. Jack unzipped his emergency kit and worked with shaking hands to splint the leg using strips of his shirt and a slender branch. "It's okay," he whispered. "I'm going to get us out of here." But he couldn't stand. His ankle was already swelling, and any pressure sent fire lancing up his leg. The rain had become a torrent now, filling the bottom of the pit with icy water. Jack looked up at the rim, only 10 feet, but it might as well have been 100. Then a sound, a familiar huff. Jack turned to see the mother bear had returned, this time, not alone. Two other bears stood beside her, slightly smaller, but just as powerful. They surveyed the pit silently. Jack held his breath. He was injured, cornered, and defenseless. But none of them made a move toward him. Instead, they began to work. The bears sniffed around the rim, pawed at the loose rock, and then, one by one, began to push. Controlled, deliberate movements. A minor slide of stones fell into the pit, forming a crude slope along one side. Jack stared in disbelief. It wasn't random, it was engineered. He tried to move, to drag himself and the cub toward the slope, but his body screamed in protest. That's when the mother bear descended. Slow, careful, she stepped into the pit, eyes never leaving his. Jack froze, heart hammering, but she didn't stop until she was beside him. She sniffed her cub gently, and for a moment Jack saw something like anguish in her gaze. Then she nudged him. Jack understood. With trembling arms, he lifted the cub onto her back. She waited until he was secure. Then she turned and climbed the makeshift path out of the pit. One of the other bears stayed above, steadying loose rocks with his paws. Rain blurred Jack's vision as he watched them reach the top. The cub let out a soft cry. The mother responded with a nudge. They were safe. Jack, still half submerged in rising water, let out a shaky laugh. His pain was overwhelming, but he was alive. He had witnessed something that defied every assumption, every line in the guidebooks. These bears hadn't just tolerated his presence, they had worked with him. He leaned back against the wet wall, eyes fixed on the rim where the mother stood silhouetted against the storm. She looked down at him one last time, and he knew her, the scar above her brow, the gentle roll in her gait. "Maple," he whispered. Years ago, he had freed a juvenile bear from a poacher's snare, waited hours in the mud as she bled, talked to her softly until she calmed, then watched her limp into the trees, never expecting to see her again. But she had remembered. And today she hadn't just remembered kindness. She had chosen to trust it. The wind screamed through the canopy, threading itself between the pines like a morning song. But Jack Tanner heard nothing. Pain pulsed in time with the frantic beating of his heart, radiating up from his swollen ankle, dulled only slightly by the cold water that now reached his thighs. He leaned back against the slick wall of the pit, rain drumming against his hat and pooling in the creases of his coat. The memory of what had just happened spun in his mind like a hallucination. The bears, 3 of them, had worked together. They had understood the danger, understood what he was trying to do. And Maple had remembered. The cub was safe now, gently carried up the crude slope they'd created, its tiny frame nestled into the familiar comfort of its mother's back. That moment, the way she had looked at Jack before she disappeared over the edge, burned itself into him like a brand. Not with fear, not even with wariness, but with something older, deeper, recognition. He pulled his radio from his coat pocket, fumbling with frozen fingers to press the call button. "Station Delta," he rasped, voice raw. "Tanner here. Cub is safe. I'm injured. Stuck in the pit. Ankle's gone. Need evac. Coordinates unchanged." Static answered him, then a voice. "Roger that, Ranger. Storm's passing. We'll have a team to you in 980. Hang tight." Jack let the radio fall into his lap. 90 minutes. Long enough for the water to keep rising, for his body to cool further, for the shock to deepen its grip. He knew enough about exposure to understand the risk. But what chilled him more than the water or the wind was the thought of what he'd just witnessed. The implications were staggering. Not just for him, not just for this forest, but for science. For humanity's understanding of animals we still believed were driven only by instinct. He gritted his teeth and glanced toward the slope. Useless to him now. The rockslide had created an exit, yes, but only for those who could walk. He tried again to pull himself up the incline, but his injured legs screamed with such white-hot pain that he collapsed with a gasp. "Don't be an idiot," he muttered to himself, voice hoarse. "You're not climbing out of here." Instead, he dug into his emergency kit, pulling out a thermal blanket and wrapping it around his shoulders. Every movement was slower now, his limbs sluggish from shock and cold. As he worked, his mind kept returning to Maple. That scar above her eye, that was no accident. He remembered the day vividly, 4 years ago, deep in a different valley. He had found her, just a cub then, caught in a wire snare set by poachers. It had nearly severed her leg. She had been wild with pain, her shrieks echoing off the canyon walls, but he'd refused to leave her. He had stayed, hands trembling, voice low, moving inch by inch until she let him close. He had cut the wire, dressed the wound, and waited with her until she could limp away on her own. She had vanished into the trees, and he had assumed she'd either died or forgotten. But she hadn't. She'd remembered, and not just the moment. She had remembered him. When her cub was in danger, she hadn't gone to her own kind. She had come for Jack. The full weight of that trust settled over him now, heavy and humbling. It was something no field manual could explain, no textbook could quantify. It was connection, real, raw, and irrefutable. He closed his eyes and listened to the forest. The storm was fading, its roar replaced by the steady drip of water from the leaves and the quiet sigh of the wind. Somewhere in the distance, a raven called, its voice high and lonely. Jack shifted slightly, trying to keep his circulation moving. As the pain in his ankle dulled into a distant throb, a warmth began to bloom in his chest, not from the blanket, but from memory. He thought of the first time he'd walked these woods, fresh out of the academy, his boots too clean, and his expectations too high. Back then, bears were data points, risks to manage, populations to track. But over the years, that had changed. The forest had changed him. It had stripped away the barriers he didn't know he'd built and taught him to listen, not just to the rustle of leaves, but to the silences between them. And then came Maple, first a wounded cub, now a mother. She had proven what he had long suspected, but never dared say aloud. Animals remember kindness, not just with instinct, but with intention. She had sought him out, chosen him. That wasn't luck. That was trust. Jack heard a sound then, soft, deliberate, not wind, not water. He opened his eyes. At the edge of the pit, peering down through the mist, was Maple. She had returned, alone now without the other two bears. She stared at him, her broad shoulders rising and falling with breath, her eyes sharp and aware. Jack didn't move. He simply met her gaze. Her head tilted slightly, the way it had earlier, as if considering him. Then she stepped forward, paws landing softly on the stones of the slope. Slowly, cautiously, she began to descend. "Maple." "No," Jack whispered. "You already saved him. You don't owe me anything." But she kept coming. Each movement was deliberate, balanced, as though she understood the danger of the loose stones beneath her. She stopped a few feet from him, nose twitching. Jack didn't breathe. He was too stunned. She stepped closer still, and then she did something that defied belief. She lowered herself, crouching close to the earth, her massive shoulders hunching as if offering herself. Jack blinked in disbelief. Was she inviting him? He didn't know what part of him moved first. Logic said this was his sanity, but something deeper, ancient perhaps, urged him forward. He crawled slowly, breath shallow, until he was beside her. His fingers brushed her damp fur. She didn't flinch. He draped an arm over her shoulders and with agonizing effort, hoisted his weight onto her back. She rose beneath him, steady and strong. Jack's breath caught. He clung to her, heart thundering. Maple turned and began to climb. Step by step, she moved up the slope, her paws careful and precise. The stones shifted slightly under her weight, but she adjusted, never faltering. Jack buried his face into the thick ruff of her neck, his fingers clutching fur. He couldn't believe what was happening, and yet it was. When they reached the top, she paused, as if making sure he was balanced, and then walked a few more feet onto solid ground before easing herself into a sitting position. Jack slid from her back, groaning as he hit the earth. He rolled onto his side, gasping. She stood and looked at him one last time. Then, without a sound, she turned and vanished into the trees. Jack lay there, soaked and stunned, as the forest returned to itself around him. The sky had begun to clear, shafts of sunlight piercing through the storm clouds. Somewhere not far away, he heard the chuff of a cub and the answering rumble of its mother. Safe, whole, together. He didn't try to sit. He just lay there, laughing softly, tears mingling with the rain still clinging to his cheeks. He had seen something no one else had, something beyond science, beyond survival. He had witnessed grace. When the rescue team arrived nearly an hour later, they found him propped against a pine, ankle-wrapped, half frozen, but smiling like a man who had touched the divine. They asked what happened. He told them everything. And when he reached the part about the climb, about Maple, the silence that followed was thick with disbelief. But he didn't care. He didn't need them to believe. He knew later, when word spread through the Forestry Service and wildlife agencies, the story was met with fascination, skepticism, and awe. Scientists came, not to trap or tag, but to observe, from a respectful distance. A small site was established near the ravine, equipped with remote cameras and motion sensors, so that Maple and her cub could remain undisturbed in their territory. No cages, no captivity, just watchful eyes and open minds. The footage they collected in the weeks to come, of Maple teaching the cub to climb, of her returning to the slope where Jack had fallen, became something of a phenomenon, a symbol of something more than survival, a symbol of remembrance. As for Jack, once his ankle healed, he returned to the ridge. Not every day, just enough to feel the wind through the trees and to know she was still out there. Sometimes, if he was lucky, he'd catch a glimpse of her from afar, standing tall against the horizon, her cub at her side. He never approached, never called out. He didn't need to, because Maple had already said everything she needed to say. And in return, Jack Tanner had learned the quiet language of trust, a language older than fear, older than logic, a language that, once spoken, never truly fades. The morning sun crept cautiously through the tall Montana pines, each golden shaft slicing between the branches like hesitant fingers trying to touch something sacred. The forest, washed clean by the night's storm, shimmered in its aftermath. Leaves dripped gently onto damp moss, and birdsong, tentative at first, began to return, tentative notes like a symphony warming up before a performance. Jack Tanner stood near the edge of the ravine, his ankles still bound tightly beneath his pants, supported by a lightweight brace that let him move with a slow but determined limp. It had been 3 weeks since the rescue, 3 weeks since the forest bore witness to something that most would still struggle to believe. He could still feel the rough texture of Maple's fur under his fingers, still remember the heat of her body beneath him, the rise and fall of her breath as she climbed that slope, not just for her cub, but for him. The memory had taken root in his mind like a seed in fertile soil, growing more vivid with each retelling, though he rarely spoke of it aloud. The few who had heard the full story called it miraculous. Others, more skeptical, had chosen to focus on the observable facts. The cub had survived, the pit had shown signs of intelligent manipulation by large mammals, and Jack had been found safely, his radio and testimony aligning with the camera footage later recovered from the perimeter trail. But none of those explanations could hold the weight of that gaze. The moment Maple had returned, not with teeth or fear, but with purpose. Jack had spent his recovery combing through his field journals, revisiting every entry about bear behavior. He reached out to biologists, ethologists, even a few neuroscientists. The consensus was cautious. While bears were known for strong maternal instincts, problem-solving, and impressive memory, what had happened that day sat firmly outside established patterns. Yet no one dismissed it outright, and that in itself was extraordinary. The forest had since grown quiet again, but different, as though it too was aware that something had shifted. The ravine, once a forgotten corner in the ranger's map, had become a place of reverence. A few well-placed cameras had been hidden among the trees at Jack's suggestion, not to disturb, not to dissect, but simply to witness. They recorded from a respectful distance, triggered only by movement, silently capturing moments that belonged more to the world than to man. From that footage came clarity. Maple had not left. She returned often, sometimes with her cub trotting eagerly at her side, other times alone, pausing at the slope they had climbed together, sniffing the earth as though remembering. She did not linger long, never more than a few minutes, but her presence was consistent. She had claimed this place, not as territory, but as memory. Today, Jack stood just beyond the camera perimeter, where the pine needles muffled his steps and the air was thick with damp bark and loamy soil. He didn't carry a weapon. He rarely did anymore. Instead, in his pack, he carried something else, a small, hand-carved token of thanks. It was crude, just a smooth piece of pine etched with the simple outline of a bear and cub, but it carried the weight of his gratitude. He knelt slowly by the edge of the trail and placed the token beside a stone, tucking it gently beneath a fern's reach. Not hidden, but not too obvious. A gift, perhaps, or just a gesture. He didn't expect Maple to find it, let alone understand it, but it felt necessary, like closing a circle that had been open too long. As he stood, a sudden rustle in the trees made him pause. He turned slowly, eyes scanning the dense underbrush. A flicker of movement, brown, low to the ground, then gone. His heart skipped. Too small to be Maple. Not human. He waited, holding his breath until a soft grunt broke the stillness. Then came the sound of cautious paws on wet leaves. The cub. Alone but not afraid, Jack's chest tightened. The young bear was larger now. Its leg healed, though it still moved with a slight limp. It stepped into the clearing slowly, head turning, nose twitching as it searched the air. When its gaze settled on Jack, it froze. For a moment, neither moved. Then Jack, barely breathing, lowered himself into a crouch. He didn't speak. He didn't reach out. He simply looked, open, steady, unthreatening. The cub watched him for what felt like minutes, then ambled toward the slope, sniffed the base, then turned back. Its eyes found the small token Jack had left and paused there. It nudged the pine carving with its nose, then gently pressed it against the dirt before moving off, disappearing into the trees with a flick of damp fur and the crackle of brush underfoot. Jack exhaled slowly, wonder blooming anew inside his chest. He had come expecting silence, maybe a glimpse if luck was kind. He had not expected this. Back at the ranger station, the footage from the trail cameras confirmed what he'd seen. But more than that, it captured something else. Maple, appearing just minutes later, nose to the ground where her cub had stood. She sniffed the token, pressed her muzzle against it, then sat beside the fern for a full 30 seconds, an eternity in wild terms, before rising and vanishing into the forest. No snarl, no fear, just presence. In the weeks that followed, word of the encounter spread. A wildlife magazine published an article. A renowned ethologist requested access to the footage for a behavioral study. One university professor even proposed a symposium on interspecies memory and emotional recognition in large mammals. But Jack stayed quiet. He didn't attend the symposium. He declined the media interviews. He spoke only once, at a local conservation gathering where he shared the story not as evidence, but as witness. Maple didn't just remember kindness, he told them, voice steady, eyes clear. She remembered who to trust and when to ask for help. The room had fallen silent, not out of disbelief, but awe. Jack saw it in their faces, the understanding that the boundaries we draw between species, between wild and human, instinct and emotion, are thinner than we think. Sometimes all it takes is one moment, one shared crisis, to reveal what lies beyond those lines. In time, the observation site near the ravine was converted into a full-scale, non-invasive study zone. Wildlife was monitored without interference, with Maple and her cub, now dubbed Echo by the research team, becoming symbols of the evolving relationship between man and nature. The footage of the mother bear returning to the ravine was played at conferences and classrooms around the world. But for Jack, the real story never lived on the screens or in the data. It lived in the soil of that slope, in the silence shared between him and a creature who had once known his hands as a rescuer's and later sought them again. Not out of desperation, but trust. He still visited the ridge, especially in the early mornings, when the forest was still waking. Sometimes he would see movement through the trees and wonder if it was her. Other times, he would simply sit, close his eyes, and remember. Because what had passed between them was more than wild luck. It was a quiet exchange bound not by words, but by something older, deeper, something sacred. And while the world tried to define it, study it, and explain it, Jack Tanner knew it for what it truly was: grace. The first true snowfall of the season came silently in the night, blanketing the Montana forest in a quilt of white, so soft it muffled even the restless murmur of the wind. By dawn, the world had changed. Trees that once stood dark and dripping with late autumn rain now held their limbs like stoic elders cloaked in frost. The sky was pale and bruised with slow-moving clouds, and the air, though still, carried a bite that promised a long, hard winter ahead. Jack Tanner stood on the porch of the ranger station, coffee steaming in his gloved hands, eyes fixed on the tree line where the forest began its endless sprawl. Snow crunched beneath the boots of a junior ranger arriving for the morning shift, but Jack didn't turn. He was listening the way he had been taught, not by the service but by the forest itself. The stillness held weight today. The animals knew, they always did. He took a final sip and set the mug down, then moved with slow purpose toward the trail that led east, toward the ravine, toward the place where the impossible had once happened. No patrols were scheduled for that area today, but he had come to treat the journey less like a duty and more like a pilgrimage. It wasn't just the memory of Maple that drew him anymore, nor even the mystery of Echo, now growing stronger by the week. It was what the place had become in his heart: sacred. A threshold between the old world and something new. He walked in silence, each step measured through the snow. His ankles still twinged when the cold sank too deep, a quiet reminder of the day that had changed everything. It had healed well, thanks to weeks of rest and the stubborn guidance of a wildlife medic who refused to let him limp his way into a permanent injury. But the ache it left behind never quite faded. He had come to welcome it. Pain was memory, after all, and memory was the bridge that kept him connected to what he could never explain. As he descended the final rise before the ravine, his breath caught. There, against the pristine white of the clearing, was movement. Not frantic, not afraid, just presence. Echo. The young bear stood at the base of the familiar slope, now partially covered in ice but still recognizable by the shape the original rescue had carved into it. Echo's coat had grown thicker, darker. The once wounded leg barely showed any sign of its former break, and standing just behind him, Maple. Her body, more massive now in its full winter weight, seemed to blend with the trees behind her. But Jack saw her eyes immediately, and they saw him. She did not step forward, but she didn't retreat either. Instead, she lowered her head and let out a low, rumbling breath that billowed in the cold. It wasn't a warning, it was a greeting. Jack stopped a few yards away, removing his gloves slowly and reaching into the pocket of his jacket. From it, he pulled a second carved token, this one more intricate than the last. The form of two bears, mother and cub, pressed into pine with careful grooves. He placed it gently at the base of a snow-covered stump, then stepped back. "This is yours," he whispered, not expecting to be heard, but feeling the words mattered all the same. "You've given me more than I ever gave you." Maple tilted her head and Echo shuffled forward with cautious curiosity. His nose twitched, then dipped to the ground where the token sat. He nudged it once, then looked back at his mother, who gave no sign of disapproval. Jack stood still, not daring to move further. He knew better now than to try and turn a moment like this into something human. This wasn't about ownership or domestication. It wasn't a bond to be labeled. It was simply a continuation, an echo of trust, living and breathing in real time. As the bears turned and began to move off into the trees, Jack remained in place until the sound of their steps vanished into silence. Only then did he breathe out, a slow exhale that steamed into the sky and dissolved. On his way back to the station, he was met by a trail tech named Riley, eyes wide and voice quick. "You're not going to believe what just came through the east feed," she said, holding up a small monitor. Jack paused, heart already guessing. Riley tapped the screen. The footage showed Maple and Echo arriving in the clearing just minutes before Jack. It captured the exact moment Maple lowered her head, the moment Echo approached the carving. But it was what happened after Jack had left that stopped his breath. The video showed Maple circling back to the stump, nudging the token with her snout, then settling beside it for nearly 5 minutes, still calm, as if watching over it. She didn't sniff for food, didn't dig or roll or mark. She simply sat, eyes trained toward the path Jack had taken. Then, at last, she rose and disappeared again into the snow-laced woods. Jack closed his eyes. That made 3 times now. 3 visits where something undeniable had passed between them. Still, the skeptics would insist it was projection, coincidence, pattern recognition shaped by human need. But he didn't feel the need to argue anymore. Truth didn't require belief to remain true. Over the next month, the cameras continued to capture Maple and Echo with regularity. They came to the ravine with purpose, but never lingered too long. And then, one morning in early December, a new sound stirred the trees. A low, melodic hum, not mechanical, not wind, a flute. Jack followed it to the edge of the ranger station clearing, where he found an old friend, Tom Running Elk, a Blackfeet elder and botanist who had known these forests long before they bore names on a map. Tom had heard the story from a park volunteer and had come not to study but to honor. Jack didn't interrupt the song. He simply stood and listened, letting the notes carry across the snow like prayer. When the song ended, Tom opened his eyes. "I believe you," he said, voice quiet but firm, "because this has happened before." They sat together by the fire that night, Tom recounting the legends of bear spirits that walked as messengers between worlds. He spoke of mothers who remembered kindness across generations, of animals who could teach lessons no book would ever contain. "When a bear remembers your name," Tom said, "you are forever changed. That is a gift and a responsibility." Jack nodded. He felt it, deep in his bones. This was no longer a singular event, a strange anomaly to be puzzled over. It was a turning, a quiet rebalancing between species that had spent too long separated by fear and misunderstanding. Word spread, carefully and without spectacle. The site near the ravine was renamed Maple's Crossing. Schools began to visit, not with crowds or cameras, but with journals and quiet feet. Children sketched the slope. They listened to stories. They planted trees nearby, each one marked not with plaques, but with names chosen for what the bears had taught them. Hope, memory, trust. Jack returned often, but he no longer hoped to see Maple. If she came, it was a gift. If she didn't, her presence still lingered in every pine, every gust of snow that drifted down the slope where something impossible once took place. In time, Echo would leave her side. He would roam the forest alone, shaped by his own instincts, but born of an event that defied explanation. Jack would keep watch as long as he could, not to intervene, but to protect the space they had all created together. One built not of fences or fear, but of something far stronger. In the end, it was not the storm that had changed the forest, nor the accident that had nearly ended him. It was the quiet moment a wild mother bear looked into a man's eyes and remembered him, remembered what it meant to trust, and in doing so gave him something no rescue, no science, no ranger's oath could ever promise. She gave him grace. The snow had deepened across the forest floor, layering each slope and hollow in soft white silence that seemed to hush even time itself. It was January now. The cold settled like a permanent breath over the mountains, and the days, pale and brief, bled quietly into one another. Most wildlife had retreated to dens, their movements reduced to instinctive rhythms of survival. But something lingered in the air near Maple's Crossing, something that transcended mere habit or migration. The forest felt watchful, as if it remembered. Jack Tanner moved through it like a shadow, his footsteps muffled by the powder beneath his boots, each one measured not by need but reverence. There was no patrol scheduled, no call for field work. He came now not as a ranger, but as a man tethered by something deeper than duty. Something born not of science or study, but of wonder. He carried with him a small wooden box, smoothed by hand, wrapped in leather cord. Inside were items that, to anyone else, would seem unremarkable. A few shed pine needles, a carved symbol of the bear's paw, a smooth stone from the bottom of the ravine where his life had changed. It wasn't a gift, not in the human sense. It was more of a tribute, a marker for a bond no language could name. The trees opened to reveal the slope, still touched by the prints of passing animals. Though the snow covered most signs, Jack's trained eyes found them easily. The subtle compression where a large body had rested, the brushed arc of fur against a low-hanging branch. He knelt near the edge and placed the box in the hollow of a tree root, pushing it gently into the earth as if returning something borrowed. Then he sat back and waited. Not with expectation, but openness. The forest had its own timing, its own logic. He had learned that by now. Patience wasn't a virtue here, It was a necessity. Hours passed in quiet communion. The wind shifted once, curling around him like a question. Crows passed overhead. A squirrel darted through the snow, paused, then vanished again. And then, just as the light began to change, he heard it. Not a sound exactly, but the absence of noise. The kind of pause that descends when something large moves with deliberate intent. He turned his head slowly and saw her. Maple emerged from the trees like a breath of the forest itself, her coat frosted at the edges, her breath misting in the chill. Echo was not with her. That fact struck Jack immediately, and something in his chest tightened. The young bear, now nearly full-grown, had not been seen on the cameras for several weeks. The team monitoring the footage suspected he had gone off to forge his own path. Jack knew this was likely, and yet, seeing Maple alone brought a weight he hadn't expected. She stepped into the clearing, each motion as fluid and silent as falling snow. Her eyes, sharp and amber as ever, met his, and for a moment the space between them felt suspended, like the air just before a snowflake lands. He didn't move. He simply watched. Maple came forward slowly, her paws crunching softly in the snow until she reached the hollow where the box now sat. She sniffed it, then nudged it lightly with her snout. The leather cord came loose, and the lid shifted. She did not disturb it further. Instead, she turned to Jack and stood for several heartbeats, as if marking the moment, then lay down in the snow facing him. It was the first time she had ever rested in his presence. All the previous encounters, she had kept her distance, remained upright, alert. But this was something else. This was surrender. Trust at its most absolute. Jack felt tears sting his eyes as he slowly lowered himself into the snow, mirroring her posture. They remained that way, man and bear, two beings on different branches of the same ancient tree, connected by something no words could shape. He didn't know how long they sat like that. Time had no shape in moments like this. But eventually Maple stood again. Her gaze swept once more over the clearing, then returned to him. And in her eyes, he saw it. A farewell. Not the kind born of grief or finality, but of understanding, of cycles, of peace. She turned and walked back into the forest, her shape dissolving between the trees, leaving behind only prints in the quiet echo of her presence. Jack remained, heartful and breaking in equal measure. He knew what this meant. This was her goodbye. Not forever, perhaps, but for now. Back at the station, he recorded the encounter with a calm hand, though his voice caught once as he spoke into the recorder. The footage from the trail camera confirmed what he already knew, that she had come, had rested, had left, and that she had not returned since. Weeks passed, then months. The forest moved on, as it always did. The snow gave way to thaw, and green crept quietly back into the bones of the land. Echo was spotted once on a high-ridge trail. Cam, large and strong and alone. A new chapter beginning. And Maple. Maple was gone. No more sightings, no tracks, no prints. No signs of injury, no cause for alarm. A storm, just absence, quiet, as if she had stepped into the folds of the forest itself and become part of it again. Jack did not grieve, not in the way he once might have. He honored her by returning each season to the clearing, by keeping the path to the slope clear, by sharing the story with those who came not to study, but to listen. Maple became more than a legend in those parts. She became a symbol of something the world desperately needed to believe in, connection that transcended species. The memory of kindness returned, the ability of wild things to recognize grace and give it back. Scientists studied the data for years. Articles were written, studies published, but none ever quite captured the soul of what had happened. That belonged only to those who had stood in the forest and felt it. On the anniversary of the rescue, a group of children from the local school hiked to the ravine. They brought with them hand-carved wooden bears, each one etched with their names. They placed them in a circle at the base of the slope and sat in silence for a full minute, just listening. Jack watched from the ridge above, heart aching with gratitude. He thought of Maple, of her cub, of the moment she had come to him not with fear, but hope, and of what that trust had built. As the children rose and began their descent, Jack remained. He walked down to the slope, picked up one of the wooden bears, and traced the small, hand-carved initials at its base. He placed it back, then turned his eyes to the forest. He didn't expect to see her. He didn't need to. She was everywhere now, in the trees, in the wind, in the rhythm of the seasons, in the heartbeat of a ranger who once thought he understood the wild, until the wild reached out and showed him otherwise. And so as twilight gathered and the forest prepared to dream, Jack Tanner stood one last time at the place where it all began and whispered into the fading light, "Thank you, Maple, for everything." The bikers attacked an old man, but a bear suddenly appeared. You won't believe what happened next. Henry Whitaker leaned back against a weathered pine tree, the early morning sun casting golden rays across the quiet lake. At 68, his bones creaked more than they used to, but he welcomed the ache. Proof he was still moving, still alive. The crisp air of Montana's Black Ridge Mountains filled his lungs, mingling with the scent of pine needles and damp earth. This was his place, his sanctuary, a place etched with memories. A loon cried in the distance, and he glanced over his shoulder to where his 12-year-old granddaughter, Emma, sat cross-legged near the tent, drawing something in her sketchbook. Her face, flushed with excitement and concentration, reminded him so much of her father that it twisted his heart. Daniel had been about her age when Henry first brought him here. They'd made this trip every summer, fishing, hiking, learning to track animals, telling ghost stories by the fire. Then the accident happened. Daniel, already a ranger like his father, fell to his death during a rescue mission in these very mountains. Henry hadn't been able to save him. He never forgot the scream, the way the wind swallowed it as Daniel disappeared over the edge. That memory, dark and sharp as broken glass, never dulled. But Emma, she brought light. When she'd asked about the trip, Henry hadn't hesitated. She was brave and curious, just like her father. This was their third night at the lake, and so far the trip had gone just as he'd hoped. Peaceful hikes, stargazing, and stories that made them laugh until their stomachs hurt. On that particular morning, Henry rose before dawn to boil coffee and listen to the wind. He watched as Emma stirred under her sleeping bag, then rolled out and began scribbling something into her book, a deer she'd spotted the night before, probably. "I'm going to gather some firewood," he said, slinging the hatchet over his shoulder. "Stay near the tent, Em. I won't be long." She nodded, already absorbed in her sketch. Satisfied, Henry disappeared into the trees, comforted by the routine. He'd only planned to go about 20 minutes out, following a familiar trail that led to fallen timber. But the forest had a way of slowing time. He knelt beside a rotted log, tapping it with his boot to check for termites, then started collecting what he needed. The sun rose higher, casting long shadows, and birdsong swelled in the branches above. It was when he glanced at his watch, realizing he'd been gone nearly 45 minutes, that a twinge of unease gripped him. He hurried back toward the campsite, weaving through underbrush with practiced ease. But as he stepped into the clearing, the world shifted. The fire was out. The sketchbook was lying on the ground, half opened, pages fluttering in the breeze. Emma was gone. "Emma," he called, his voice steady but sharp. No answer. He moved to the tent. Empty. His eyes darted to the shoreline. No footprints in the sand, just the drag marks of a stick. He circled the site, heart thudding. "Emma!" he shouted again, louder this time. A crow cried out from a tree, but the forest remained silent. The panic didn't explode all at once. It came in creeping waves, an icy sweat, a tremor in his hands, memories flooding back, Daniel's face before he fell. Henry shook them off and took a deep breath. No time for fear. He crouched near the edge of the clearing, scanning the ground. Years of ranger work came rushing back. Axe veered toward the trees. No sign of a struggle, no signs of a predator. She'd wandered off willingly. Henry's worry deepened, but so did his focus. He slipped his pack over his shoulders and took off, following the faint path into the woods. Emma had about an hour's head start. He could catch up, but only if he moved fast. As he trailed the prints, Henry's mind ran wild. What if she got lost? What if she fell? What if... Number. He stopped himself. Emma was smart. She had her whistle, her compass, her little survival pouch he'd made with her. But these woods were dense. If she panicked... He moved faster, tracking the way the footprints turned, paused, then disappeared where the ground grew harder. He studied broken twigs, strands of blonde hair caught in a branch, a candy wrapper caught under a root. All clues she was still moving. Still okay. He refused to think otherwise. Meanwhile, deeper in the forest, Emma sat in a wooden chair inside a dark cabin, hands tied behind her back. Her eyes were wide but dry. She had cried once when the man with the long beard grabbed her, but not now. She stared at him, at the others. 4 of them. Rough-looking. Bikers, maybe. One of them had a tattoo of a bear's skull on his neck. Another wore mirrored sunglasses despite the shadows. The one in charge, Jack they called him, paced slowly. He'd been the one who recognized her name when she whispered it. Whitaker. "You say your name's Emma Whitaker?" Jack asked again, his voice like gravel. Emma didn't answer. She remembered what Grandpa taught her. Stay calm, observe everything. Jack stopped pacing and knelt beside her. "You know a man named Henry Whitaker?" Emma's heart skipped. She nodded slowly. Jack smirked, but there was no joy in it, only bitterness. "That son of a bitch cost me everything," he muttered. "Years ago, my brother died because of him, and now here you are." He stood stepping away, speaking more to himself than to her. Fate has a funny way of circling back. Emma didn't fully understand, but she could tell. This wasn't just a random kidnapping. They knew Henry. They were after him. Jack turned back. "We're going to Black Ridge Point," he said, eyes gleaming. "Let's see if old Henry remembers what happened up there." Back in the forest, Henry pushed through dense brush, sweat pouring down his face despite the cool morning air. The prince had vanished again, but a broken fence post caught his eye. Old, moss-covered. Beyond it, tire tracks. Fresh. Not the kind you'd see from hunters or campers. These were thick, deep, left by motorcycles. His stomach turned. There shouldn't be anyone out here. He followed the tracks carefully, keeping low, stepping around patches of dry leaves. Eventually, he came to a rise in the land and froze. Below, tucked in the trees like a cancerous growth, was an old hunting cabin, one he'd condemned 20 years ago. He recognized it instantly. Smoke curled from the chimney. A motorcycle leaned against the porch. He dropped to his belly, pulling out his binoculars. Through the dusty window, he saw movement. A figure, a man, another. Then, her. Emma. Tied. Alive. He nearly shouted but caught himself. His hands shook as he lowered the binoculars. She was okay, but not safe. Not yet. Henry's eyes flicked around the clearing. 4 men, armed. He didn't stand a chance in a direct fight. He'd have to wait for the right moment. He reached into his backpack and pulled out an old Ranger radio. Static. No signal this deep. He whispered a silent curse and began planning. As the sun dipped behind the ridgeline, the woods grew darker. Somewhere in the distance, a branch snapped. Henry turned sharply. Something big was moving through the trees. Something that didn't sound like a man. He held his breath, and then, low, deep, and unmistakably close, a growl. The growl vibrated through the forest like a warning from the earth itself. Low, thunderous, and filled with an ancient authority that stopped Henry mid-breath. He crouched lower into the underbrush, scanning the darkening woods. Shadows played tricks on his eyes, but he wasn't imagining the shifting of branches or the heavy footfalls just beyond the tree line. A bear. That sound could only come from something massive. For a moment, Henry considered retreating. He knew the signs, knew how to move quietly, how not to provoke. But the bear didn't sound agitated. It wasn't thrashing or charging. It was stalking. Then he heard something else. A yell, sharp and panicked. A man's voice from the cabin below. Another growl followed, closer now. He crawled forward through the thick ferns and peered through the brush. The scene unfolding below was surreal. Jack and his men had burst out of the cabin, weapons drawn, eyes darting. One of them fired a shot into the trees. Birds exploded from the canopy, and Henry instinctively ducked. But nothing came charging out. Immense, thick-furred, gray along its back and shoulders, muscles rippling under its coat. Its eyes glinted gold in the twilight. It didn't roar or charge. Instead, it advanced with calm, deliberate steps, its focus entirely on the cabin, on Emma. Henry watched, heart pounding, as the bikers hesitated, unsure whether to shoot or run. Jack stepped forward, gun raised, and the bear stopped. It didn't flinch. It simply stood its ground, breathing heavily. Then Emma emerged in the doorway, untied now, her hands shaking but her legs steady. She looked directly at the bear. Henry saw her lips move. She wasn't screaming. She was speaking to it. Slowly, the bear turned its head toward her. And then, impossibly, it stepped between her and the men. Not threatening, protecting. Henry couldn't believe what he was seeing. Emma moved down the porch steps, cautiously, as if she understood something no one else did. The bikers were frozen, staring. "What the hell is that thing doing?" one of them hissed. Jack didn't answer. Henry's instincts screamed. This was the moment. He slipped from his cover and circled around the clearing's edge, keeping low, silent as the wind. Emma was edging toward the trees, and the bear backed with her, still facing the men. As Jack raised his gun again, the bear growled. A warning this time, louder, more primal. The men stepped back. Emma disappeared into the woods. So did the bear. Henry, moving fast now, cut into the trees to intercept her path. He crouched behind a fallen log, heart hammering. Then he saw her, blonde ponytail, dirt-smudged face, eyes wide with recognition. "Grandpa," she gasped, throwing herself into his arms. He caught her tightly, whispering her name again and again, feeling her trembling against him. "Are you okay? Did they hurt you?" he asked, inspecting her quickly. She shook her head. I was scared, but the bear. "Grandpa, it saved me." Henry looked around. "Where is it?" Emma pointed. "Right there." He turned, and sure enough, the massive gray shape stood 10 yards away, watching silently. Its chest rose and fell in slow, steady breaths. It made no move to come closer. Emma stepped toward it, but Henry held her back gently. "Don't get too close, Em." "He won't hurt me," she whispered. He found me when I ran. I think he was following me before. He led me away from them." Henry stared at the bear, his old ranger brain ticking. There was something in the way it moved, something familiar. 15 years ago, he murmured, half to himself, I rescued 3 bear cubs. Their mother had been shot by poachers. We raised them in the sanctuary, released them later up in the North Ridge. One of them had a gray streak down his back. Emma's eyes lit up. "This one has that." Henry looked again. The bear blinked, then slowly sat, massive paws folded calmly. "You think it's him?" Emma asked. Henry didn't answer right away. He stepped closer, slowly, keeping his hands visible, moving with the practiced respect of a man who had shared the woods with creatures for decades. The bear didn't growl. It watched him, studied him. Then, to Henry's astonishment, it made a low, soft chuffing sound, the sound young bears made when recognizing a familiar scent. Henry stopped. "Shadow," he whispered. The bear's ears perked slightly. Behind them, a gunshot cracked through the trees. A bullet slammed into the dirt not 5 feet away. "Run!" Henry shouted, grabbing Emma's hand. They tore through the forest, branches whipping past, roots grabbing at their boots. Behind them, the bear roared. Not a warning this time, but a battle cry. Another shot rang out, then silence, then crashing, violent and wild. Henry and Emma didn't look back. They ran for nearly 20 minutes, deeper into the mountains, until the trees thickened and the terrain became too steep to sprint. They found an old ranger lookout tower, half rotted but stable enough to climb. Henry ushered Emma up the ladder, then followed, pulling the hatch closed behind them. Both of them collapsed, gasping. "Did you see him?" Emma asked between breaths. "He came with us. He scared them off." Henry peered out through the cracked window. The trees swayed quietly. No sign of the bear, no sign of the men, but something told him Shadow wasn't far. "He's watching," Henry said. "I can feel it." They rested until the stars emerged, the cold creeping in. Henry lit a small lamp and unrolled a blanket. Emma leaned against him, exhausted. He wrapped his arm around her, heart still racing. "We're not safe yet," he said quietly. "They'll come looking. Jack, he wants revenge." "Who is he?" Emma asked. Henry sighed. "A poacher's brother. Years ago, during a sting operation, I chased his brother near Black Ridge Point. The man ran, slipped, and fell. I tried to grab him, but I couldn't hold on. Jack thinks I let him die. Desperate. So what do we do? Henry looked at her, his granddaughter, so young but already so brave. We keep moving, find help. But he's going to try to end this where it all began. At Black Ridge Point. Emma shivered. And Shadow? Henry looked back out the window. Moonlight filtered through the trees, and for a brief second, he thought he saw a glint of gray fur. Shadow's not just following us, he said. He's guarding us. Below, unseen in the shadows, the bear stood motionless near the tower. It lifted its nose to the wind, scenting the air, listening. Then it turned its massive head toward the darkness and waited, for danger, for the child it had chosen to protect, for the man who had once saved it long ago. By the time the sun rose over the Black Ridge Mountains, painting the treetops in amber and firelight, Henry was already on edge. He hadn't slept more than a few minutes, his ears tuned to every rustle outside the lookout tower. Emma, curled up under the blanket with her head on his shoulder, had finally drifted off around midnight, exhaustion overtaking fear. But Henry had sat in the corner beside the window, with the rifle across his lap. An old Ranger-issued Winchester he never thought he'd need again. Every creak in the forest, every gust of wind sent adrenaline spiking through his chest. Yet nothing had come. No sign of Jack or his men, no gunfire, just the occasional soft snap of twigs and the subtle scent of pine sap drifting through the broken window. But something had come, he was sure of that. Not something dangerous, something watchful. At some point during the darkest hour, Henry had seen a pair of gold eyes blinking from the shadows below the tower. The same shape, the same slow, patient breathing. Shadow. And now, morning. Henry stirred as Emma woke, rubbing her eyes and blinking into the golden haze. "We're still here," she murmured, voice scratchy. "Yeah," Henry replied, "but we need to move." He peered through the binoculars at the forest edge and saw no movement. That worried him. Jack wouldn't stop. Not now. Not after Emma escaped. "We're heading for the old ranger trail that cuts through the eastern ridge," he said, tightening the straps of his pack. "It's steep, but it'll give us the high ground and access to the radio tower." "Will it work?" Emma asked. "Maybe, if the antenna's still intact." They climbed down the tower carefully. Shadow was gone. No sound, no trace. But Henry felt the bear's presence like gravity, like a silent guardian moving just beyond view. They made their way east, deeper into the old-growth forest, following faint paths overgrown with ferns and knotted roots. Henry taught Emma how to read the trees, where north moss clung, how to spot claw marks from black bears versus cougars. She listened intently, eyes wide but steady. Every now and then, they paused to check for signs they were being followed. So far, nothing. But then, just before noon, Henry spotted it. A partial boot print in the mud. Large, fresh, too close. Jack was closing in. They pressed on, faster now. Henry's heart pounded, not just from the climb, but from something deeper, something old. Black Ridge Point wasn't far now, only a few miles as the crow flies. But to get there meant threading through steep ravines, clambering across fallen logs, and keeping low through territory only rangers and ghosts remembered. Around mid-afternoon, they reached a narrow ravine where the air turned cooler and the wind picked up, whispering through the pines like voices. Henry motioned for silence. They crouched low as he scanned the tree line. Then he saw it. Movement. Not far above, 3 figures moving quietly across a ridge. One of them had a rifle slung over his back. They hadn't seen them yet. Henry turned to Emma and mouthed, "Stay here." She nodded. He crept forward, finding cover behind a thick outcropping of mossy stone. From there, he watched the men move. Jack wasn't among them. These were his scouts, looking for trails, guessing their escape route. One of them knelt to examine a broken branch. "They came this way," the man muttered. "Fresh." Henry turned back, ready to guide Emma down the slope and reroute. But the sound of growling stopped him cold. Not near him, up on the ridge. It started low, then rose like thunder. Branches snapped. The 3 men wheeled around, weapons drawn. Then chaos. A massive blur of gray fur burst from the trees above and collided with one of the men, sending him flying into a tree trunk with a sickening crack. Another screamed, firing wildly. The bear was everywhere and nowhere, moving with terrifying speed for something so large. Henry shielded Emma as the shots rang out, echoing down the ravine. Leaves exploded around them, then silence. A scream quickly cut off. Another shot, then nothing. When Henry looked again, the ridge was empty. No men, no bear. It was Shadow. They didn't wait. Moving quickly, they skirted the ravine and rejoined the ranger trail, old and narrow, winding between jagged cliffs and sheer drop-offs. It was here, as the late afternoon sun turned red, that Emma asked the question that had been lingering in her eyes since morning. "Why did you name him Shadow?" Henry smiled faintly. "When he was a cub, he used to follow me around the sanctuary, silent as a ghost. I'd turn around and there he'd be, never making a sound, just watching, like a shadow, always just behind me. And now he's doing it again," she said softly. Henry nodded. Maybe he remembers. Maybe it's instinct. Or maybe something more. They reached the final bend before the Black Ridge Point overlook, just as dusk bled into night. The air here was colder, sharper. The cliff loomed ahead, steep, treacherous, and painfully familiar. Emma stared at it. "This is where he fell, isn't it? Jack's brother." "Yes," Henry said quietly. "He was running from me. His pack was full of illegal pelts. I tried to stop him. He panicked, slipped. I grabbed him, but he couldn't hold on. He blamed me. Or Jack did. Do you think Jack knows the truth? Number. But I intend to tell him." They camped just off the cliff, lighting no fire, eating cold granola bars as the stars emerged one by one. Henry kept watch. Emma slept, curled in the hollow of a tree. And then, near midnight, a sound broke the stillness. Footsteps. Slow. Intentional. Henry rose, rifle in hand. Jack stepped into the moonlight, gun at his side, face drawn and hollow. He wasn't alone. Two more figures behind him, one limping. "You came," Jack said. "Alone, like I said?" Henry nodded. "Let her go, Jack. This is between you and me." "Oh, she's not going anywhere," Jack snapped. "Not until you admit what you did." "I tried to save him," Henry said. "I didn't push him. I didn't let go. I held on until the cliff gave way under us both." Jack's expression twisted. "Liar!" Then came the growl. Deep, resonant, and dangerously close. Jack spun as Shadow emerged from the shadows, eyes gleaming in the moonlight, his body scarred from battle but unbowed. The two men behind Jack raised their weapons. Henry shouted, "No!" But it was too late. Gunfire exploded. Shadow roared in charge. The world broke into chaos. The gunfire tore through the silence like thunder cracking the night sky. Bullets sparking against stone, ricocheting off the rocks near the cliff's edge. Henry threw himself in front of Emma, pulling her down behind a fallen log as bark and dust exploded around them. Shadow's roar answered the shots, primal and earth-shaking, louder than anything Henry had ever heard in all his years in the forest. The massive gray bear charged through the hail of bullets, seemingly impervious to the pain, his massive paws thundering against the hard earth. One of the men screamed as Shadow collided with him, the force sending him flying off his feet and into the underbrush with a sickening crash. The other man tried to run, but Shadow's body swept sideways like a battering ram, knocking him flat, his rifle clattering uselessly across the rocks. Jack stood frozen, gun shaking in his hands, his face pale beneath the moonlight. Henry rose slowly, rifle lowered, not wanting to provoke another shot. "Jack!" he shouted. "It doesn't have to end like this." But Jack wasn't listening. He was staring at the bear, lips trembling. "He's a monster," he whispered. "You trained him to kill." "He's protecting," Henry said, his voice calm but commanding. "Not attacking. He only came because you made this into a war." Jack's eyes snapped to Henry. "You let my brother die." Henry stepped forward slowly, carefully, his hands open. "I tried to save him, Jack. He slipped. I grabbed him. I held on as long as I could. But the cliff, he was too heavy, too panicked. He kicked. He was trying to pull himself up, but he fell. And I've lived with that every single day since." Jack's face twisted, years of hate and grief tangled in his eyes. "You're lying." "No," Henry said softly. "I wanted to save him. I reached out, just like I'm reaching now." Jack blinked. For a moment, something flickered in his eyes. Confusion, recognition, doubt. Then Shadow moved again, and Jack flinched, raising his gun. "No!" Emma screamed, stepping out from behind the log. Jack spun toward her, and for a terrifying second, his finger twitched on the trigger. Henry's breath caught, but Jack didn't shoot. He hesitated, lowering the gun slightly, eyes flicking between the girl and the bear. "She's just a kid," he muttered. "She's got nothing to do with this." Shadow stepped between them again, massive and silent, his fur matted with blood, breath ragged. He was wounded. Henry could see it now. One of the bullets had torn through his shoulder. Blood trickled down his leg, soaking into the soil. This bear, he saved her? "More than once," Henry said. "He remembered me. Remembered what I did for him all those years ago. And now he's repaying that debt." Jack's gaze dropped to the ground. He looked lost, like a boy caught in a storm, years of vengeance unraveling in a matter of seconds. But the cliff beneath him didn't care about regrets or redemption. With a deep groan, the earth trembled. Rocks shifted. The edge of the overlook, already unstable from years of erosion, began to crack. "Move!" Henry shouted, but too late. Jack stumbled backward, his foot catching on loose gravel, arms flailing. The ground gave way. Henry didn't think. He lunged forward, grabbing Jack's wrist just as the man's body slid over the edge. Jack cried out, eyes wide with terror, legs dangling above the sheer drop. It was happening again, just like before. Henry gritted his teeth, his knuckles white, feet skidding forward as the crumbling edge gave way beneath him. "Don't let go!" Jack screamed, his other hand scrambling for a grip. "I'm not," Henry shouted, "but I can't hold." And then a heavy force braced behind him, a warm body, muscles pressing into his back, weight grounding him against the slope. Shadow. The bear leaned into him, its massive paw gripping the rock behind them, acting as a wedge, as a wall, as an anchor. Henry felt the pressure of the bear's body keeping him steady, felt the warmth of its breath against his neck. With a final surge, he heaved Jack upward, dragging him onto solid ground just as the last of the cliff gave way, plummeting into darkness below. Henry collapsed beside Jack, gasping for breath, chest heaving. Shadow backed away, swaying slightly. His legs buckled. He groaned, a deep, low sound of pain and weariness. And then he fell to his side. Emma rushed to him, tears spilling down her cheeks. "No, no, please, stay with us. Please." Henry crawled to her, laying a hand on the bear's massive shoulder. Shadow's breathing was shallow. His eyes, still golden, met Henry's for one final time. In them, Henry saw recognition, memory, farewell. Shadow exhaled once more, then stilled. The forest went silent. Emma sobbed into Henry's chest and he held her tightly, stroking her hair, heart aching in ways he couldn't describe. Jack sat nearby, stunned, hands trembling. "He saved us," he said, voice cracked. "The bear. He saved me." "He saved all of us," Henry replied. It took hours for the authorities to arrive. By then, Henry had used the emergency radio beacon stashed near the old ranger trail, and a rescue team airlifted in. Shadow's body was recovered with reverence, his story already starting to spread among the team. DNA tests would later confirm it. This was indeed one of the 3 cubs Henry had rescued 15 years ago. Shadow had remembered. He had come back, and he had given everything. Jack, visibly shaken, gave a full confession to the authorities. He named names, exposed the trafficking ring that had pulled him and his brother into poaching years ago. He testified willingly, said he owed it to the bear who had saved him from his worst self. The case made national news. Wildlife organizations rallied, donations poured in, and a new sanctuary was proposed, one that would protect orphaned animals like Shadow, founded in his name. 6 months later, Henry stood once again at the edge of the Black Ridge Forest, Emma beside him, holding his hand. The air was quiet, soft with the sounds of summer, And then, from between the trees, a movement. A smaller bear, gray-tinted, emerged from the underbrush. Younger, slenderer, watching them with curious eyes. Henry and Emma froze, hearts thudding. The bear stepped forward, just far enough for the sunlight to catch its coat. Emma whispered, "Do you think it's his cub?" Henry nodded slowly, a tear slipping down his cheek. Maybe, or maybe, it's his spirit, watching over us again. The young bear paused, sniffed the air, then turned and disappeared into the trees without a sound. Emma smiled softly. They came to visit. Henry looked at her, eyes full of pride and sadness and hope. "Some bond," he said, voice rough, "can never be broken." Together they turned away from the trees and walked down the mountain, the forest behind them whispering stories of shadows and salvation, of grief and redemption, of the silent loyalty between a man and a bear that no one would ever forget. The first snow of winter fell lightly over the Black Ridge Mountains, drifting through the air like ash from a dying fire, dusting the trees, the trails, and the earth with silence. It had been nearly a year since Shadow gave his life to save them, and the world in its unpredictable way had moved on, but not for Henry and Emma. The bear's sacrifice had become a symbol far beyond what either of them expected. Bridge. Wildlife protection groups cited him as living proof of memory and loyalty in animals. Politicians used his tale to push legislation. Children across the country wrote letters to Henry and Emma, sending drawings of a great gray bear with golden eyes and a kind heart. And in the middle of that whirlwind, Henry found himself, for the first time in years, at peace. But peace didn't mean stillness. Since that final night at Black Ridge Point, Henry had become something he hadn't been in decades. A voice. He spoke at schools, ranger gatherings, wildlife conferences, always with Emma at his side. She had changed too. There was a quiet strength in her now, the kind that only came from surviving something no child should have to face. She no longer looked away when people mentioned fear or violence or loss. She leaned in, she answered. She told the truth, even when her voice trembled. And with every story, every memory shared, Shadow lived on. Today they stood at the entrance of the newly finished Shadowlight Sanctuary, a sprawling haven built where Henry had once patrolled decades ago, nestled between Black Ridge's southern slopes and the wide river basin below. The sanctuary was named by Emma, who said the bear hadn't just come from the shadows, he had been the light inside them. And now his name was carved into stone at the entrance, a statue of him standing tall beside a plaque that read, "In memory of Shadow, protector, guardian, friend." Henry touched the edge of the bronze paw gently as a breeze stirred through the trees, cold and whispering, like an echo of the past. The ribbon-cutting ceremony had ended hours ago. The crowds were gone. Only a few sanctuary workers remained, walking quietly among the newly fenced clearings and wooden viewing platforms. Inside already, 2 young black bears, rescued from poachers, explored the artificial dens with nervous steps. It was working, all of it. But Henry wasn't thinking about the visitors, the reporters, or the work ahead. He was watching the tree line beyond the sanctuary, that familiar edge where wild met human, where mystery lingered like fog. That's where he saw her. Emma, now 13, was kneeling beside the clearing's edge, staring across the distance. She had grown taller, her frame still slight, but her eyes had depth now, quiet and alert, with a fire beneath them. She stood and walked back toward him, her breath puffing white in the cold. "Did you see it?" she asked softly. Henry turned to her. "See what?" "There was a bear," she whispered. "Not in the enclosure, out there, just beyond the trees." He looked where she pointed. The snow-covered brush was still. "Are you sure?" "It was watching," she said. "Not afraid. It looked like him." Henry nodded. Over the last few months, she had mentioned the sightings more than once. A younger gray bear, always distant, always quiet. Wildlife cams hadn't caught it. Rangers hadn't spotted it. But Emma swore it had followed them, once near the river, once during a speech in Bozeman, once even near their cabin. "Maybe it's real," Henry said. "Or maybe it's him, reminding us he's still here." Emma smiled faintly. Either way, I don't think he's finished watching. That night, back in the cabin they'd built on sanctuary grounds, a modest place of pine wood and stone, Henry sat by the fire, the old ranger maps spread across the table. Emma sat nearby, drawing quietly, her pencils scratching rhythmically against the paper. He watched her for a moment, the soft light catching her face. "You miss him, don't you?" he asked. She didn't look up. "Every day." "Me too." She finally met his eyes. "Do you ever wonder why he came back? After all those years?" Henry leaned back in his chair, staring into the flames. "I used to think animals didn't remember, that they lived in the moment. Instinct, survival, but Shadow proved otherwise. He remembered the kindness, the safety, maybe even the love. So he followed us." "No," Henry said. "He found us. And when the time came, he chose to protect what once protected him." Emma looked down at her drawing. It was Shadow, standing in front of her as he had that night, fierce and still, the moon glowing behind him. But this time beside him was a smaller bear looking up. "Do you think he was a father?" she asked. "Could that young one be his cub?" "It's possible," Henry said. "And if it is, then he's not really gone, is he?" She nodded, and for a long moment they sat in silence, the fire crackling, the snow tapping softly against the windows. Then as the wind howled once more, Henry heard it again, a sound outside. Not footsteps, not voices, a low, familiar chuff. He stood, heart pounding, and crossed to the door. He opened it slowly. The cold hit him first, then the stillness. But just beyond the tree line, where the shadows thickened, a shape stood. The same streak of silver down its spine, the same calm presence. Emma stepped beside him, her breath catching. "It's him," she whispered. "His cub." The bear blinked slowly, then turned and vanished into the woods. They stood there for a long time, side by side until the last flake of snow settled on the ground. Later, Henry placed a photograph of Shadow on the mantel. Beside it, a new one, a blurry image Emma had managed to snap of the young gray bear at the edge of the river last spring. Beneath it, she had written in careful script, "Legacy." And that was what remained. Not just the memory of a bear who saved them, not just the scars or the grief, but the legacy of loyalty, of protection returned, of a bond stronger than fear, deeper than words, forged between man, child, and beast. In time, the sanctuary would grow. More animals would come. More lives would be saved. And every time a ranger walked the grounds or a child listened to Emma's stories, Shadow would walk with them, unseen but never forgotten. In the heart of the Black Ridge wilderness, where snow fell quietly and pine trees whispered old truths, one truth endured above all else. Some shadows protect, some memories return, and some spirits, especially those born of love and loyalty, never truly leave.